welcome back to the Washington Outsider report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us, we have Ilya Somin to discuss a topic that's become at least somewhat controversial in recent weeks and months. I think that's not an exaggeration, which is the constitutionality of tariffs, and specifically Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariffs and everything that preceded and followed them. And of course, Ilya Somin is an American legal scholar. He's a law professor at George Mason University. He's the B. Kenneth Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute, a blogger for the Wall of Conspiracy, and he researches constitutional law, property law, migration rights, and the study of popular political participation and its implications for constitutional democracy. All of these topics are areas in which I personally have a lot of questions concerning this administration, but we will try to stick to the topic at hand because there's a lot to discuss there as well. So, Ilya, before we get started, could you tell us a little bit why and how you decided to focus on these particular areas of constitutional law? And from there, how did the property rights come into the profile, given the fact that in the US, you would think that this should not be a fraught topic. It should be fairly settled in many areas. Why isn't it?
So that's actually a whole different topic from the one I thought we were going to be talking about with regard to tariffs, though I
This is
suppose
just
there's
a
some
background
indirect
there,
connection.
actually.
However, I went to graduate school originally because I wanted to become a political scientist. Then I decided to get a joint degree and also get a law degree for
Mhm.
two reasons. One is I thought it might be easier to get a job as a law professor than a political science professor. Also, back then in the 1990s, I did not like the male-female ratio in political science graduate school, namely from my perspective as a heterosexual male, the ratio of men to women wasn't that great. It was too high. I thought law school might be better in that regard. In retrospect, that second reason was not a particularly smart reason to go to law school, but the first reason of wanting to be a law professor did work out, and I decided I was interested in constitutional law. With regards to property rights, it is true, we do have several different provisions in the Constitution protecting property rights in various ways, but as I and other scholars have documented, we also have a history of often not doing a good job of enforcing those provisions. So, for instance, we have a history of using takings to forcibly displace large numbers of people from their homes, and we also have a history of using exclusionary zoning to make it difficult or impossible to build new housing in response to demand. If you're interested in this topic, listeners can check out my recent Texas Law Review article, The Constitutional Case Against Exclusionary Zoning, where I and my co-author Josh Braver explain why this kind of zoning is unconstitutional and why it also causes enormous harm by cutting off millions of people from housing and job opportunities. But today, I think we're supposed to talk about a different threat to housing and job opportunities and the American economy, namely the trade war that our esteemed president has started.
So the reason I brought that up is you'll see where I'm going with that in a second. Donald Trump and some of the members of his administration have struck me as people who, seem to be playing fast and loose with rights in general and with the issues not just of takings specifically, but in general anything that affects their personal interests from an economic perspective versus what should be strictly speaking, confined by the law. The reason I'm mentioning this perspective that many people have commented on in other contexts is because there are allegations that his policy on tariffs comes from the same sort of um, angle, comes from the area of not particularly caring or respecting rights and how they're going to be affected by economic policies. Would you say that this is consistent with what you're observing, or would you say there's no connection whatsoever?
By and large, I would say yes, it is consistent in that if you look at, say, the Republican Party before Donald Trump, it was by no means perfect in these regards, but it was a party that, at least to a large extent, and at least rhetorically, said they were committed to free markets and property rights and to minimizing government intervention in the economy. Since the Trump transformation of the Republican Party into more of a big government nationalist style party of a kind that we traditionally see in Europe, that is not true. That's most obvious in the areas of immigration and trade, but it's even more, but it's also clear in some other areas like their love for industrial policy, for trying to support certain industries at the expense of others, and also their disrespect for the rule of law. And of course, Donald Trump, before he went into politics, was notable for violating contracts and property rights, and even for being a developer who tried to use eminent domain to get the government to seize property for his benefit. Indeed, when I was in law school, one of the cases that I worked on at the Institute for Justice when I was a summer clerk there was we worked on an eminent domain case against Donald Trump where he was trying to condemn an old lady's home so that he could use it as a parking lot for one of his casinos. We eventually won that case, not much thanks to me. I was just a lowly, summer clerk. But he lost that case. But that case, as well as much of his career, is an example that he has little, if any, regard for property rights or for free markets when they get in the way of things that he wants to do. And he now has an entire administration and a political movement, which is also like that insofar as, they're against free trade. They're in favor of government favoritism towards certain industries at the expense of others. And also, they have dropped most serious efforts to try to restrict government spending. The Doge stuff is in the headlines very much, but in reality, government this year is actually spending more money than they did last year in the equivalent period. So such cuts as Doge has made are minor in comparison to the places where they actually want to increase spending.
I'll get to the spending portion of the discussion momentarily, but I want to zero in on the tariff policy.
Sure.
Given there's a huge argument whether or not anyone actually voted for what Trump is currently implemented, and people argue that they misunderstood what he was saying, or the extent of the tariffs, or that they believed that Trump would use tariffs just to make certain minor political concessions, as he did initially with, or appeared to do so with Canada and Mexico, but would actually not make it the centerpiece of his policy, regardless of what of how people see it. Trump did campaign on the issue of tariffs. To what extent, where did he cross the line from a policy that is populist, protectionist, and so forth, but within his constitutional authority to something that you are currently now challenging? Where is that line, and who, how do we define the constitutional authority regarding this sort of economic policy?
So whether he campaigned on this or not, or whether people voted on it, is irrelevant to the question of whether it's legal and also to the question of whether it's right and just. Evil doesn't become good because a lot of people support it. But it probably also is true that while some of the people who voted for him definitely did want massive protectionism, there are probably a lot of other people who voted for him because either they thought he was good on other issues even if not good on this one, or they thought he really wasn't going to do tariffs on the massive scale that he was talking about. Certainly a lot of people in the business community, it seemed like, did not really expect him to do this, including even some of his own core supporters like Elon Musk, who is now angry about the tariffs, even though frankly he should have expected that something like this could happen. But all of that is irrelevant to the issue of whether this is legal or whether it's beneficial. Legally speaking, he cannot just implement tariffs on this scale just on his own say so. And the power to impose tariffs and regulate international trade under the Constitution is listed under the enumerated powers of Congress, not those of the president. Now, he claims that this enormous trade war, which affects almost every country in the world and would be the biggest trade war since the Great Depression, he says it's authorized by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. That act doesn't even mention tariffs among the powers that are granted to the president by the legislation, and no other president has ever tried to use it to impose tariffs. And even if it did hypothetically allow tariffs, there are other problems, and I'll just mention a couple of them. One is this can only be used, this act, it can only be used to do anything at all when there is an emergency. There is no emergency here. An emergency, by its nature, is a sudden, unexpected crisis. Here, what we have is trade deficits with various countries that have existed for decades, and there's nothing of an emergency nature about them. Indeed, they're not even harmful at all. Having a trade deficit with a foreign country is not damaging to the US economy in any meaningful way. Economists across the political spectrum agree with that. And it's not much different than I have a terrible trade deficit, I have to admit, with my local supermarket. They almost never buy anything from me, but almost every week I buy food and other things there for my family. And yet, that trade deficit is not somehow bad for me. And similarly, if we have a trade deficit with Canada or Mexico or Japan, that's not bad for the United States as a nation. In addition to requiring an emergency, the statute also says that there has to be an extraordinary or unusual threat to Americans' economy or security. And there's nothing extraordinary and unusual about trade deficits, and they're not a threat at all, even if they were somehow extraordinary or unusual. So that's, under the statute. If you like, I can also explain where if there was uncertainty about the statute, then the measures taken would also be unconstitutional.
Yes, let's look into that, and also let's look into if these powers are designated to Congress. How did Donald Trump come to make such prominent use of them, and why does no one seem to mind all that much, except for a couple of entities, including you and your colleagues, who are challenging that now?
Yeah. So I would say a couple things. One is a lot of people do seem to mind. Polls show that this trade war is actually extremely unpopular, with some 60% of the public opposing it. And we have a lot of, it's not just we who have sued to challenge it in court. There's a lawsuit by the state of California pending, which the state of California rarely agrees with the much more conservative organization that I'm working with in this case, but they do here. There's also another lawsuit challenging the tariffs against China filed by the New Civil Liberties Alliance, which is a conservative group. And there's a lawsuit against the Canada tariffs filed by members of the Blackfeet Nation, which is a Native American tribe, which objects to it on various grounds. So there's a great many people and organizations who are opposed to these tariffs. We are not alone, though we are the first to file a comprehensive lawsuit against the entire Liberation Day scheme. I wonder as to why Trump tried to resort to this statute. Obviously, I don't know for sure. He didn't consult me ahead of time. If he had, I would have told him not to do it. But I think the reason why they want to use the IEPA statute as opposed to other statutes which more clearly authorize tariffs is because they think that if they can first there are few procedural requirements under IEPA. There's not a requirement of an investigation or a hearing or notice and comment and the like, because the whole point of this law is to deal with sudden emergencies. And they also hope that obviously to if they succeed here, then they can claim the power essentially to enact any tariffs against any country for any amount for any reason they want. And they obviously like the idea of nearly unlimited executive power. So
Who doesn't?
well, most presidents obviously do like having super broad executive power, but Trump, you might say, has trumped even his recent predecessors like Bush and Obama, who were not slouches in that department, but even they did not do any power grabs quite as broad as this one. In the Biden administration, probably his biggest power grab, which I also opposed, was trying to forgive $400 billion in student loan debt without congressional authorization. What Trump has done here makes even that look small. Over the next decade, the Tax Foundation estimates that this would be approximately 1.4 to 2.2 trillion dollars in taxes imposed on Americans, and that doesn't factor in the broader economic costs or the costs of retaliation by foreign trading partners. So I guess Trump decided, you know what, I want to do a much bigger abuse of power than Biden because I can't be outdone by him in this area. So that's what he has done here.
Well, let's break it up because there's a lot to unpack here. And let's look at this idea of having a national emergency for tariffs. Trump announced one, but I'm not sure how many people actually understand what the alleged emergency actually is or is purported to be by the administration. I think it's probably not an emergency, but let's understand what the argument the administration is making. Why are they claiming the sudden urgency?
So they've actually announced two different emergencies that are relevant to this. Initially, in February, they announced a national emergency with respect to fentanyl crossing our borders, and that was used to justify tariffs against Canada, Mexico, and China. I would argue there's no emergency there either because drug trafficking across the border is a ubiquitous consequence of having a war on drugs where we've created a large black market. Moreover, in the case of Canada, the amount of fentanyl crossing the border is actually infinitesimally small. And in the case of Mexico, the fentanyl is almost entirely transported by U.S. citizens crossing back into the US. So it's not clear that Mexican trade policy or Mexican government policy generally really has anything to do with it. But then on April 2nd, with the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, they announced an even dumber and even more unjustified national emergency, where the supposed emergency is that we have a trade deficit in general and specifically bilateral trade deficits with numerous countries, which for reasons I mentioned earlier, that's not even an emergency or even a problem at all. And I would add that they've even imposed tariffs on numerous countries like Switzerland and Israel that don't actually have any tariffs against US goods at all. They've also imposed tariffs even on some countries where we have a trade surplus with them. And most hilariously, against the Heard and Marshall Islands territory, which is in a set of islands in the Indian Oceans inhabited only by penguins and seals. So we don't have any trade of any kind with them, but yet they're still getting tariffed. There's no emergency here. There's no extraordinary unusual threat. And there's no connection even between the supposed emergencies and threats and the measures that are being taken. It's very obvious that the supposed emergencies are really just a pretext for starting a massive trade war.
So let me become even more nerdy and lawyerly here. Let's discuss the word emergency and what that actually means in legal parlance. What does it take to constitute an emergency on a federal level? How is there a common definition of what is an emergency and when the president is allowed to announce it, or can they announce it an emergency anytime they feel like it, if
So
they consider it politically convenient?
So there's no legal definition of emergency that is somehow different from the way the word is defined in ordinary English. But I would add that when the House of Representatives enacted the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, they specifically issued a report where they actually explained what they mean by emergency. And there they said that an emergency is something that is rare and unusual, and it certainly cannot be, quote, a normal situation. That is the very opposite of a trade deficit, which is a normal situation that happens all the time and is certainly not brief and unusual. So in that instance, we actually have evidence on what the people who framed this law thought an emergency was supposed to be, and it's what you and I would think an emergency is in sort of speaking ordinary English. So it is true that in issuing emergency declarations under the National Emergency Acts, both Trump and some other presidents have frankly abused the term and issued emergency declarations for things that are not really emergencies. But in this case, with respect to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, we have evidence on what emergency is supposed to mean, and it's not this. And it's even more clear that there is no extraordinary and unusual threat. For this act, in order to use it, it's not enough to have an emergency. It also has to be an extraordinary and unusual threat. So even if you think that an emergency is just whatever the president says it is, that isn't necessarily true for an extraordinary and unusual threat. And for this law, in order to use, you're going to have both an emergency and also an extraordinary and unusual threat. And neither one of those things actually exists.
So look at this for a second, because let's say then the so-called emergency is announced. Is there a scope? Is there a limitation on how long that's supposed to last? And at what point you're supposed to explain if there's any progress on combating it and what's the end goal and objective? If there's an emergency, then clearly there has to be a path to unemergencying it, to making the situation less urgent, less dire, countering the threat. What is the objective of these tariffs in terms of the framework that the administration has announced?
So those are great questions. I'll give you a sort of a general answer regarding the National Emergencies Act and then a more specific answer regarding this case. The general answer is that there is a flaw in the National Emergencies Act, which is that if an emergency is declared and courts allow the emergency to go forward, that is, they don't rule that it isn't actually a real emergency, then then the emergency can in effect last as long as the president wants it to last, unless Congress enacts legislation terminating the emergency, and such legislation is subject to veto by the president. And as you probably know, a veto can only be overridden with a two-thirds supermajority in each House of Congress, which particularly in our polarized era is extremely difficult to do. Originally, under the National Emergencies Act, enacted in 1976, there was a provision for a legislative veto. That is, the Congress could terminate the emergency without being subject to veto by the president. But the Supreme Court, in a case called INS versus Chadha, which was decided in 1982, they ruled that legislative vetoes are unconstitutional. So now we have the system of emergency declarations where once it has been declared, unless it's successfully challenged in court, it can potentially last as long as the president wants it to last, which is yet another reason why courts should take seriously the other limitations in the act and also should take seriously the issue of what an emergency is and what it is not. In terms of what the administration is trying to achieve, they have not set out any criteria for when these tariffs might be listed. There is a so-called reciprocity formula that is written into the executive order that applies to some of the tariffs. But even if the reciprocity formula is somehow met, there would still be 10% tariffs on the entire world, and also the 145% tariffs on China, which would still be the biggest trade war since the Great Depression. The reciprocity formula itself is totally nonsensical and also incorporates a mathematical error. If you're interested in this, the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, has a website devoted to explaining the mathematical errors in their formula. But the formula is total nonsense in that it even leads to tariffs on countries like Israel and Switzerland and others that have few or no tariffs on the United States. So it's really not a reciprocity formula at all, in that the other country can have tariffs of zero, as Israel and Switzerland do, and yet there's still reciprocity tariffs, so-called reciprocity tariffs that get imposed on them. So there is no end goal imposed in the order, and even if there was, if this order is legal, then the president could modify the order anytime he wants. He wakes up on the wrong side of his bed. He decides, you know what, like those penguins in the Herd Islands, they've been disrespectful to me, so I should impose more tariffs on them. Or, I'm mad at France or Germany or Canada or Israel, so I'm going to impose some more tariffs on them. And given if courts accept the claims of authority made by the White House, then he would be able to do things like that. And that, in practice, is a very serious threat to our economy and to the international trading system, because as we've learned from our clients in this case, and common sense says this as well, people who engage in investment and international trade, they need relatively stable expectations. If you're going to invest in a factory or you're going to make contracts for delivery of goods, that system cannot work properly if at any time, the tariff rate could be doubled tomorrow if the president wakes up on the wrong side of his bed.
So the part that before we get to the part about the court, part of the discussion about the courts, what I don't understand is why has the Congress voluntarily given up its powers to the president when they have an interest in keeping as much power for themselves as possible, if only to force Donald Trump and the other members of the executive branch to negotiate and give them concessions in exchange for going along with his agenda.
So that's a great question. Part of the answer is, as I said before, when Congress enacted this law in 1977, they did not expect that it could be used in this way, and indeed properly interpreted. The power that it delegates, while significant, is nowhere near as sweeping as what Trump has tried to claim. But you might ask, well, why doesn't Congress now pass legislation
Sure.
to terminate these tariffs? There is actually bipartisan legislation both in the House and in the Senate that has been introduced by various members of Congress, like Chuck Grassley, a Republican senator, and Maria Cantwell, who has worked and she's a Democratic senator. There's legislation in the House introduced by the Republican representative Don Bacon. But there are two problems with here. One is we have a great deal of partisan polarization. So Republican members of Congress are very reluctant to limit the powers of a president in their own party, especially a president like this one who might retaliate against them by sponsoring challenges in a Republican primary. The second problem is the one that I've already mentioned, which is that even if this legislation passes Congress, in order to override a near certain veto by Trump, you would need a two-thirds majority in each house, and it's extremely unlikely that that can be achieved.
So, given that the Congress is virtually powerless in this situation, we are relying on the courts to govern. Have there been any emergency injunctions or petitions prior to the major cases that we'll discuss momentarily to put an end to these policies or to freeze or to review these policies?
So there's a total of I think four major cases, including ours, that have been filed challenging this policy. None of those cases has had any rulings in it yet. But in our case, we have asked for a preliminary injunction and a temporary restraining order, which in plain English, those are measures that would freeze and block implementation of those tariffs while litigation in the case continues. The state of California, in the case they have filed, has asked for similar remedies. And there are also two cases that are against not the entire system of Liberation Day and IEEPA tariffs, but against just parts of it. One case filed against the China tariffs, filed by the conservative New Civil Liberties Alliance, and one filed by members of a Native American tribe that I mentioned earlier, which are against the elements of those tariffs that are imposed against Canada, because this tribe has members in both the U.S. and Canada, and they want to be able to trade freely with with the members on the other side of the border. So in all of these cases, I think it could well be that there will be rulings of some kind even as soon as the next 2 or 3 weeks. And we are talking now on April 18th.
After speaking more broadly of these issues, do you expect either now or sometime in the future for international treaties to come into some sort of a review, renegotiation, or legal action based on on the seemingly arbitrary nature of these tariffs and the way it threatens international trade? In other words, are there any international treaties, either bilateral or multilateral, that are potentially being violated by this framework, the Liberation Day framework?
Yes, it is very likely that this violates the World Trade Organization treaty. And if I remember correctly, I'd have to check on this, but I think China has commenced an
Mhm.
action against the
Correct.
United States in the WTO. However, the usual remedy if you win a case in the WTO is that the other country gets to retaliate against you if you don't comply with the ruling. And other countries are already beginning to retaliate against the US, Canada, the European Union, China, all have measures that either they've already implemented or are going to implement. So the WTO process by itself may not stop this. I think it's also likely uh, that the measures against Canada and Mexico violate the NAFTA treaty, which was since renegotiated, ironically, by Donald Trump as the U.S. Mexico Canada trade treaty. which was renegotiating in 2018. I think it's pretty obvious that the parts of this that impose tariffs on Mexico and Canada violate the NAFTA treaty or the USMCA treaty, whatever you want to call it. However, it's not clear that there is a judicial remedy against that, and so we are proceeding in our lawsuit on the basis that that these tariffs simply are beyond the power delegated to the president. And if hypothetically Congress were to delegate this much power to the president, we argue it would be unconstitutional to do so because it violates even the most minimal possible limits on delegation of legislative power to the executive. It is possible that the government of Canada or the government of Mexico will try to file a complaint under the USMCA treaty, and I'm not sure how that would work out, if they did.
Look closer at your cases,
Oh,
at
there's
your.
actually one more point I'd
Oh,
like to
sure,
make about
sure.
international agreements, which is that if Trump is allowed to get away with this, this will totally destroy any incentives that foreign countries, even close allies like Canada, will have to make any trade agreements with us in the future. Because if any trade agreement can just be, set aside and overridden anytime the president feels like imposing some new tariffs, that totally destroys the entire point of making agreements, which is that we want the agreements to create a stable framework so that people in both our country and in our trading partners know what the rules are and can expect that their products will not be subject to tariffs, or at least subject only to limited tariffs. It's kind of like if you and I make a contract and say you agree to pay me money for some goods I'm going to deliver to you. If at any time I can say, you know what, I'm not going to deliver those goods unless you pay me twice as much money as we previously agreed, or I'm going to deliver to you only half of what I promised. If I can do that at any time, you obviously are not going to make agreements and contracts with me. And the same thing applies here. That the whole point of making trade agreements is that they're supposed to be binding. And Trump is just basically saying, I don't care. I feel free to violate these agreements anytime I want. And obviously, no one wants to deal with a person like that.
We are already seeing a lot of this arbitrariness because no sooner Trump announced the Liberation Day tariffs that only a couple of days later he announced a pause, which nevertheless overall still imposed tariffs even on places where previously there weren't any. So
Yeah.
despite the quote unquote pause, it still ultimately still brings up the tariffs from nothing or to at least 10%.
Yeah, so this is a system that, if it is allowed to stay in place, means that our entire trading relationships with other countries will be at the whim of one man. So he wakes up one day, he imposes the entire Liberation Day tariffs. Then he says part of it, though by no means all, is paused for 90 days. Then a few days later, he says, well, for the moment, he doesn't say for how long, certain electronics like iPhones and iPads are going to be exempt. But obviously, on this system, what Caesar gives, Caesar can take it away, and he can take it away anytime he wants. And that's no plausible way to run an economy or an international trade system. People can't live with a system like this because even if today your goods are not tariffed, there's always the risk that tomorrow, he will change his mind and start tariffing them again. And that's why we want a trading system based on the rule of law rather than on the whims of any one person.
Hmm. So let's look at your case and how it would impact this current situation. What exactly are you challenging? How's your case different from the other three cases that you mentioned? And what are the legal issues specifically involved? And
So I already
moreover,
mentioned.
where exactly are you filing that case?
Sure. Our case is in the Court of International Trade, which is the U.S. federal court that specializes in hearing cases specifically related to tariffs and trade policy. That court is located in New York City, but it has jurisdiction over the entire country. The other three cases have all been filed in ordinary district courts. There is a complex set of jurisdictional issues about whether it's better to file this kind of case in the Court of International Trade or in a district court. I'm going to probably cabin that and not talk about it too much right now because it's really complex and technical, and also because there are some issues here that I don't want to discuss publicly because they're
Sure.
matters of our technical legal strategy. The other way in which our case differs from the others is that, as I mentioned before, the New Civil Liberties Alliance case is only about fentanyl-related tariffs against China, not against the Liberation Day system, which is much broader. The case filed in Montana by members of the Blackfeet Nation Indian tribe, it is only against those parts of the tariffs that relate to Canada, both the fentanyl-related tariffs and also the Liberation Day tariffs. So in one sense, it's broader, but overall, their case is narrower than ours. It's only about Canada. And finally, the case most recently filed by the state of California, that one is the most similar to ours. They're challenging the Liberation Day tariffs, but they're also challenging the previous tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. So they're challenging sort of the entire system of IEEPA-based tariffs created by Trump. So their case has more similarity to ours, though there are also some technical legal issues there that are different from ours, such as the basis on which they would get standing, which I can talk about if you're actually interested in this, which you may
Yes,
not be.
actually,
You
I
do
think
want to
that would
know.
be
Okay, so let me just very quickly
sure.
explain the standing thing, then I'll get back to bigger issues. So,
Mhm.
under Supreme Court precedent, which I don't fully agree with, but the Supreme Court decide these things, not me. It's if you want to sue to challenge somebody's illegal action, it's not enough to say, I think they violated the law. You also have to prove that you've been harmed by the supposedly illegal action, and that's called the doctrine of standing. In our case, we are representing five businesses that import from many of the countries that are subject to these tariffs, and therefore these businesses themselves pay the tariffs, and that's the harm that we're claiming. I think we have basically an open and shut case for standing. In California's case, in reading their complaint, I think part of their standing argument is that the state of California is harmed by the damage to its economy caused by these tariffs, which is a more debatable case for standing, but it also may be the case that California itself imports goods from some of these countries, particularly Canada and Mexico. And in that event, it's possible that they're also paying tariffs and have standing on the same basis as our clients do. But that aspect I still need to discuss with representatives of the state of California. I'm not entirely sure about it.
Right. So getting back to the broader issues, what is the basically, is there any legal precedent for deciding these tariff-related frameworks, or is it a novel issue that is groundbreaking because of the sweeping nature of this challenge?
I would say some of it is novel and some of it isn't. What is novel is the use of the statute, the IEPA law, to impose tariffs at all. And it's also novel for the president of his own initiative to impose tariffs on this enormous gargantuan scale. The last time something this large was done was during the Great Depression with the notorious Smoot-Hawley tariff, which helped deepen and extend the Depression. And that was a terrible law, but at least it was an actual law enacted by Congress. Smoot and Hawley were members of Congress, and the tariff is named after them because they were the guys who pushed it through. This, by contrast, is an effort by the executive to do it. But I will note, however, there are relevant precedents in the so-called major questions doctrine. The Supreme Court, in a whole series of cases, has said that when the executive claims the authority to decide a major economic or social issue, then they can only do that if Congress has clearly delegated the power to them. It's not enough that there is an ambiguous statute. It has to be a clear delegation. And over the last several years, it has struck down a number of presidential initiatives that way. The biggest was, Biden's student loan forgiveness program that I mentioned earlier, but there was also a national eviction moratorium established under Trump's first administration and continued by Biden in order to help fight the COVID pandemic. That was struck down as a major question. And there's a couple of examples, other examples as well. What is going on here is bigger than any of those other things that was previously ruled to be a major question by the Supreme Court. It makes even Biden's massive student loan forgiveness program look piddling and insignificant by comparison. So if this is not a major question, I do not know what is. There is also constitutional precedent where the Supreme Court has said there are limits to Congress's power to delegate legislative authority to the executive. So,
Hmm.
assuming hypothetically, I don't think this is actually true, but assuming that this law actually does give Trump the power to enact whatever tariffs he wants anytime he wants, this would be such an enormous delegation of power to the president that if there are any limits on legislative delegation of power to the executive at all, this has to run afoul of those limits. That this is really the biggest non-delegation issue to come to the courts. Again, since the Great Depression, where the Supreme Court in a 1935 case known as the Schechter-Poultry case, they struck down the National Recovery Act, which was a law that gave the president the power to set wage and price controls throughout almost every industrial sector of the economy. The Supreme Court, in a decision where both liberal and conservative justices agreed, they said that's going too far. That's too much delegation of legislative powers to the executive. This case, if the courts were to rule that there really is a delegation, this would be the biggest delegation to come before the courts since that one. And we hope in that event the courts would rule that this is also unconstitutional.
As an aside, I have seen some stories about Congress allegedly, uh, probably with a nod from the administration, discussing potential limited wage and price control options for certain things. I don't know whether that's going to go anywhere or not, but that certainly harkens back to the same Great Depression era issue. Although, of course, obviously, the delegation wouldn't be in question because Congress is the one initiating these measures. But getting back to tariffs, would, in your opinion, the administration try to block this, essentially try to oppose these arguments by saying, well, Congress is not really delegating, and it's not really a delegation issue if this is an emergency.
So there's no emergency exception to non-delegation
Uh-huh.
doctrine. If this is a legislative power to begin with, still the executive can wield it if it can do so at all, only if Congress delegates it.
Mhm.
And Article 1 of the Constitution specifically says that the power to impose taxes and tariffs and also the power to regulate international trade, that those are legislative powers. I think even the Trump administration doesn't deny that they are legislative powers. They just claim that the IEPA statute has delegated them this authority in this incredibly sweeping manner. So there are some other constitutions which have general emergency provisions, like some European constitutions, and notoriously in history, the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, which was then abused by the Nazis. But notably, our Constitution does not have any general emergency power provisions. They do have things like the clause that allows suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in the event of war or invasion, but there is no general emergency power that allows the executive to, override constitutional limitations as a general matter.
So hypothetically, if the courts were to rule in your favor, would that mean that they would then also simultaneously strike down the alleged emergencies announced by the Trump administration?
So it depends on what basis they rule in our favor. If they rule in our favor on the basis that the emergency declaration is itself illegal, then there would be no emergency declaration anymore. But there are several other grounds on which they can rule in our favor that wouldn't require them to rule on the definition of emergency. For example, they could simply say that there's no extraordinary or unusual threat, which would strike down the tariffs, but in theory, the emergency declaration would remain in place. Or they could rule that the statute is unclear and therefore the tariffs are struck down under the major questions doctrine, Or, of course, they could rule that this is an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power, which would strike down the tariffs. But in theory, it's possible, depending on how the ruling was worded, that there would still be an emergency declaration. But an emergency declaration that doesn't do much of anything is much less dangerous than an emergency declaration that leads to the biggest trade war since the Great Depression and to massive damage to the American and world economies.
Not to nitpick, but there's two other questions that I have about this. The first being the courts have been notorious for preferring not to deal with constitutional questions as much as possible and focusing on more pragmatic legal matters. Do you see that becoming an issue?
If it becomes an issue, it will actually help us because there is this doctrine that the Supreme Court has, which says that if a federal statute is ambiguous, then it should be interpreted where possible in a way that avoids constitutional problems rather than a way that raises them. And here, as we point out in our filings to the court, there is an interpretation of IEPA that is relatively narrow, that would avoid constitutional problems with delegation. For instance, they can interpret IEPA as not allowing tariffs. Then this whole non-delegation issue goes away and the court would not have to address it. Alternatively, they could say there's no emergency. That would also avoid the constitutional question. Or they could say there's no unusual and extraordinary threat, which the statute requires in order to make use of it. If they say any of those things, they can avoid the constitutional problem. Even if they were to say that the major questions doctrine requires ruling in our favor, that too would avoid the constitutional issue because technically the major questions doctrine is a doctrine of statutory interpretation, not a constitutional doctrine. So if they want to avoid the constitutional question, I say, great, you guys can avoid it because you can rule in our favor on any of these other bases. Though I would note courts do actually quite often address constitutional issues, so it's certainly not the case that they avoid them all the time or even perhaps most of the time when they could be raised.
The other issue is, well, the obvious question here is about the delegation of powers between Congress and the executive branch. The judiciary has been the center of legal controversies with this administration since practically day one. Various members of the administration claim that that activist judges are overstepping their bounds in challenging executive action, and they have notoriously refused to follow or to implement some of the orders in several different instances, including the return of a Maryland resident who was sent to El Salvador, including the reinstatement of the AP journalists into the press pool and some other issues I may be leaving out. How do you see this going in terms of implementation of the judicial rulings if they are in fact in your favor?
So obviously, this is an issue that goes well beyond our specific case. In our system of government, it is important that the government obey judicial rulings that go against it. Otherwise, they can eliminate or undermine all or nearly all constitutional constraints on their powers. So if they play fast and loose with court orders and continue doing so, then the judiciary has to crack down on them. Hopefully, Congress might get off its rear end and also take action. Ultimately, violating court orders is illegal in a whole bunch of ways. It's actually a crime, and therefore it would justify impeaching and removing this president and other government officials who collaborate with him in disobeying court orders. Hopefully, they will be forced to back down and ultimately obey various court orders. But again, this is an issue that goes far beyond our specific case.
So let's play devil's advocate for a moment. You've listed a whole bunch of reasons why the courts should rule in your favor. Do you foresee potential reasons why they wouldn't?
So there's no good reasons why they shouldn't rule in our favor. We have several different good arguments, any one of which is enough to win the case. So if they chose not to rule in our favor, it would likely be because of a misguided sense that somehow these sorts of issues should be left to the executive and that the courts should not second guess them, perhaps because national security is involved. even though in this case there is no actual plausible national security problem. Indeed, the real threat to our national security here is the damage to the economy done by these tariffs and the damage to our relationships with our allies. Historically, our closest ally is Canada. I would not have thought until this administration that we could somehow alienate them and cause them to be hostile. But now we have both the Prime Minister of Canada and his leading opponent, the Conservative Party leader in the current election. They're both saying they can't trust the United States anymore because we're poisoning the relationship. If you've gotten to the point where even Canada is no longer friendly anymore. I think the real national security threat is the administration that has created that situation rather than judicial efforts to require them to follow the rule of law. So I think we have a very strong case on the merits. Obviously, courts sometimes make mistakes, so I can't guarantee that we will win. All I can say is that it would be a very serious mistake if the courts were to ruin the administration's favor on this and thereby allow one man virtually unlimited power to control our international trade system and damage the US economy.
And in the worst case scenario that it does by some chance happen, is there any room for appealing or going some other judicial route?
So, of course, if we lose in the trial court, we can appeal, in our case, to the Federal Circuit, which is a court of appeals, and ultimately to the U.S. Supreme Court. It is very likely that whichever side loses in the trial court will appeal at least to the next level, and it may be that whoever loses in that court might appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't have to take the case if they don't want to.
Do you see this case potentially as something that could go all the way to the Supreme Court?
For almost any case, the odds against going to the Supreme Court are quite high because they only take something like 60 or 80 cases per year. So I would say, if I had to predict, I would say it's more likely this case will not go to the Supreme Court than that it will, just because you can say that about almost every case.
Sure.
However, I will say, and I hope this is not perceived as some kind of arrogance on my part. It's not about me. Because of the importance of this case, it has a higher than average chance of getting there because it literally deals with a massive trade war and a massive expansion of executive power. So it is possible that the Supreme Court would take this case because of its greater importance, both in and of itself and for the precedent it would set. One can also imagine scenarios where our case is resolved differently from one of the other cases that are filed in other courts around the country related to this. And in that event, the Supreme Court might want to resolve what is known as a circuit split, that is a division between different federal courts of appeals.
That's an interesting point right there because, well, first of all, I don't necessarily foresee you guys losing, but I do foresee the administration not giving up very easily, even if the verdict is against them, simply because they've already invested so much into this framework, and they also just challenge literally everything that goes against them anyway in other cases. So I don't see why they won't now. Regarding the what you said as circuit split, you mentioned that those three other cases are going through different courts, not through the International Trade Court, but through regular district courts. Do you see those district courts taking, and those cases are somewhat different, but do you see them taking a different, uh, applying different judicial philosophy to reviewing those cases as opposed to what the path that you're seeing with your case? Do you foresee potential differences?
So it's hard to know for sure. I think the plaintiffs in those case have strong arguments just like we do. One can argue that those that are limited to just the Canada or China tariffs, it's not quite as much of a major question, or it's not quite as big of a delegation claim. But still, they have arguments similar to ours, and therefore I would contend they deserve to win for many of the same reasons as we deserve to win.
Mhm.
However, it is possible that the courts there will come to different conclusions than the Court of International Trade. It is also possible, as I mentioned before, I think that those cases will end up getting transferred to the Court of International Trade because the Trump administration has actually filed motions in at least two of those cases requesting the court to transfer the case to the Court of International Trade. And obviously, if all those cases, if hypothetically all the cases get transferred to the Court of International Trade, then it is likely that that court will try to come to a common resolution of them, though there are some issues that exist in some of these cases that do not exist in others. For example, the case involving the Blackfeet Indian tribe has claims that are based on treaty rights of Native American tribes. They argue they have a right to be free from tariffs under treaties that they signed from the federal government. And that's obviously an argument that exists in that case that doesn't exist in the other cases.
I want to tie this fascinating discussion back with by circling back to the idea of property rights. Throughout this debacle, um, well, I haven't heard that actually brought up as a legal argument in courts yet, although the day is still young. I have heard it argued online and elsewhere by assorted Trump affiliates and defenders, which is to say, to individuals who are complaining about these policies, you don't have the right to cheap stuff. You don't have the right to a new iPhone or to whatever it is that you're importing from outside, or companies that make parts of the that are part of the complex global supply chains. You don't have the right to certain price on these products. That has been the argument. Has there been, do you foresee a legal challenge from private individuals or businesses claiming that that the administration is potentially, in addition to all these trade related, but in Congress related challenges, do you see them challenging a potential impediment to private property rights?
So there are actually what might be called individual rights or property rights arguments that are in the Blackfeet Nation lawsuit. They have
Hmm.
made arguments like that. Uh, as a general rule, courts have tended to hold that taxes and tariffs are not subject to constitutional constraints to protect property rights. Maybe they should be. That's a whole other discussion we can have. But there's a distinction generally between the taking of property rights, which is limited by the Constitution, and the imposition of taxes, including property taxes, which generally speaking, there are relatively few limits. However, even if you don't have a constitutional property right to low prices and free market economic transactions, we do have a right to see the constitutional separation of powers enforced. And I would argue that a just government actually would not restrict these free market transactions and would not forbid us to buy the goods that we want voluntarily through free market transactions, whether they be goods from abroad or goods within the US, unless there's some overwhelmingly compelling reason to do that. Sadly, under current Supreme Court precedent, we don't have an individual right like that under the Constitution, but we do have a right to the enforcement of separation of powers rules, including that the president cannot massively usurp congressional authority as he's doing here.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think this conversation will be greatly appreciated by many people trying to figure out what's going on. And does seem both simple and complicated at the same time. Simple because, these tariffs are absurd, but complicated because the government has nearly infinite resources to adjudicate, to challenge these
Yeah.
anyone who disagrees in courts. So this could drag on for quite a while, I'm afraid.
It could, though we are seeking, as I said before, a preliminary injunction, which, if we get it, would block these tariffs from being implemented while the case is litigated. We think we have a good case for that, though obviously, it's going to be within the discretion of the court to decide that issue.
Thank you so much. And this was quite enlightening. And I urge everyone who watched this discussion to go to the websites and check out this additional background information to also understand both legal and political sides of the issues that are being challenged. And they're not going away anytime soon, at least as a point of argument. So I think it's important to understand why people are concerned about these tariffs, why organizations are putting their resources towards providing this sort of information, and why these tariffs could be dangerous to US prosperity and to the way we do our business and live our lives on a daily basis. Thank you so much to Ilya Somin for coming in and joining us today. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. We'll be back next week, 9 p.m. as usual. And thank you for everyone who stayed with us. Have a great evening.